Hey everyone. So, in this section of the course, we're going to look at different study methods that you can use to address the different parts of your game that we're aiming to improve based on the evaluation that you've already done. So, a big part of the reason I put this together after the evaluation is so that we can match up the right types of study for the right concerns that you have. And first, I'm going to give you the quick overview of all the different methods of study that I think are useful and a few of the common pitfalls in terms of how I would say the average poker player is using these different methods of study. So, first, the total overview of what I've included here on the short list of kind of the most important or most common methods of study: poker content, sims, a database or like a tracker, and coaching and community. So each of these deserves, I think, attention as to how we're going to use it, more than simply thinking that if we put enough time into each of these methods of study, or one or two of these methods of study, that we're going to get better. So the goal here is to be deliberate about how and why we're studying the way that we are. So I want to talk about poker content a little bit. I think that it's really useful. I think that poker content is the most common method of study by a long shot. It's lower barrier to entry. It's relatively easy to put time into. And the major pitfall that I'm pointing out in this section is the passive approach to poker content compared to the active approach to consuming poker content, I should say. So when I'm thinking about training videos, obviously I've made a lot of training videos, and one of the most valuable things I've noticed through my one-on-one coaching time with different students is that a lot of the information that I put out in training videos is information that they're aware of or that they are able to kind of read back to me, but not necessarily information that they've internalized and translated to success in their poker game. And it's really hard to break through that barrier, but a big differentiating factor, I think, is taking an active approach to watching training videos. So when I watch a training video, I try to think of it as a virtual coaching session with whoever it is who's running that training video. And I think that it's a valuable opportunity to get into the head of the coach and really break down what it is that they're doing on screen. So if it's a live play video, and this comes up a lot with final table replays as well, which I'll kind of put in the same category. If you're watching a live play video, that's an opportunity to see every little routine decision that coach is making, whether or not they address it in what they're saying. So if you want to actively watch a training video compared to passively, you should be pausing frequently. You should be taking notes on what it is that they're doing. You should take note on what they mention and what they don't mention, and interact in the comments and make a point to get to the bottom of all the things that you don't understand about what it is that they're doing at the table. And I think when you start taking this approach with training content or with streams like with YouTube or Twitch streams, you start to realize you realize the depth of information that's hidden in this content. Because in my opinion, the most valuable part of these videos is not necessarily what the coach is saying, but it's, or what the streamer is saying or whatever, but it's the opportunity to watch a cards up replay of an expert player. And that kind of brings me to final table replays, which is a little bit separate. If you're a tournament player, I think final table replays are one of the most valuable things that you can study. But again, the approach needs to be active instead of passive. So the main difference between final table replays and training videos or streams is that the final table is revealing everyone's cards, and the players are not necessarily like willing participants in that recording. Obviously, they've approved the content being made, but they're not producing that for training purposes. This is their actual strategy being revealed to the world or to whoever's watching. And there's nothing they can do about that. So all of that information can be cataloged, can be studied through, and game planned around for the future. So I think it's very much akin to watching game tape. If you're, for example, playing a team sport and you're preparing for a match against a common opponent, you would observe that opponent playing against other people. You would observe that opponent playing against other teams, and you would take note of their habits, and you would take note of their skill set, and you would game plan around that skill set. And this is really important and often, I think, overlooked in the poker realm. But all of that information is available to us, and passing on that opportunity as a method of study, I think, is leaving a lot of money on the table. So that's something that I'm going to do more deliberately in the game planning section for Heads Up. I will kind of walk through a method for observing and game planning around an opponent. But I just wanted to point out that for any tournament players who are watching this course, I think that any time spent watching final table replays is an opportunity to analyze and game plan for your opponents. And I wrote poker books on here. I'm sure that a lot of you watching this have read a good number of books and continue to read a good number of poker books. And again, I think that you don't simply want to assume that whoever it is that wrote that book can teach you everything that you want to learn simply by reading through it. I think you want to dig in a little bit as to the why and perhaps the specific expertise of that author. Having a plan for what you're going to take away from that book is going to change your mindset from a passive mindset to an active mindset. So again, just sticking with that theme, when you're consuming content, having a strategic approach to why you're there and to what you're trying to take away from it. Taking written notes, marking pages, doing research on who the author is, doing research on what they're good at, figuring out what it is exactly you're trying to take away from that content, rather than just hoping that by consuming content in whatever means possible, you're going to benefit from it. So I'm going to move on to Sims, which is really the hallmark method of study in modern poker. Or when people talk about modern poker, I think what they're talking about is solver-based poker or solver-informed poker. And I would say that this is the most common difficulty that my students have. It's a very broad topic, of course, but just generally speaking, interpreting Sims, making the most of Sims, running your own Sims in a way that makes sense. This is something that will have its own dedicated section in another video. But just generally overviewing what we're trying to get out of Sims and sharing my mentality on how to use them. These are some of the most important categories of either solvers or whatever you want to call it. I'm breaking custom solvers. This would be like PO solver, Munker solver, simple preflop. I'm separating that from pre-solved databases. This would be your GTO Wizard, your Odin. I want to distinguish those because a custom solver has its own capabilities that I think should be used in a certain way compared to pre-solved databases, which have their own capabilities and for that reason should be used in a certain way. And that's going to get their own. Those are both going to have their own video on how I like to use those programs. But thinking about those as a separate tool and used for a separate purpose, I think is important. A lot of people that I've worked with are trying to only use one or the other and trying to use it for pretty much everything, which I think is leading to some shortcomings in the use of solvers. Preflop charts, sort of as a different type of reference material from preflop solvers. Both, I think, serve their purpose. But for most players, I would say if you're like a 6max online player or if you're a tournament online player, having a pretty large library of preflop charts is kind of mandatory. But of course, you should know if those preflop charts are appropriate for the game or if they've been solved correctly for what you're trying to get out of it. And that's something that I'll talk a little bit more about later, but just generally making sure that the preflop solutions that you're using are appropriate for the game that you're playing. And if they're not, trying to figure out how you can adapt them. GTO Trainer is a really important category of solver. I guess we're calling it solver. This is a big the difference and what I've spoken about before already. The difference between theoretical study and practical study is sort of the differentiating factor between solvers and trainers. So I think that solvers are appropriate for studying theory, and I think that trainers are appropriate for developing skills. And that's going to have a pretty large focus later in this course. But I do think that treating a trainer as a practical tool and using it in a practical way that replicates gameplay is an important mindset to have when using those programs in comparison to a slower method of study, a more deliberate method of study that's designed at using solvers, POSolver, whatever, that's designed more for developing your theoretical knowledge and not so much trying to just make you execute better at the table. And I wrote in here learning heuristics. I think this is just a big overarching important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about using solvers in general and looking at solutions in general. We're really not, and this does have its place, but we're really not using solvers with the goal of figuring out if your line was approved or if your hand is solver approved. And I hear this a lot. It's very detrimental, I think, to the learning process to use these tools in a way where the only thing we're hoping to get is like a stamp of approval from a computer program. And that's a very misguided way of using this information, in my opinion. The best thing that you can take away from a solver is a overarching strategic pattern. And it takes a lot of different solutions and a lot of study to get to the point where you can confidently take away those patterns. You can also use aggregated reports, and aggregated reports will have its own video because I think they're quite important for sticking with this mentality, which is the big picture is what these programs are powerful enough to reveal. And the micro details are so sensitive and so in some situations misleading that I think simply plugging in a hand history and looking to see if your line is approved or not is more often going to be damaging than it will be helpful. So the next method of study that I think deserves a lot of attention is your database. And I wrote here more than a tracker. You know, your Hold'em Manager, your poker tracker, whatever program you're using. This is your collection of information about how you play, about how your opponents play, and really just a living history of all of the information that you've gathered from your experience at the online poker table. Obviously, this is an online specific method of study. A lot of live players who I work with understand the value of having a database and will actually put in time, let's say at smaller stakes or in a fast-paced game online, with the intention of collecting data so that they can learn more about their own game. And I think this is so smart as a method of study for a live player. So I do want to make note that even though this is a method of study that's much easier and geared in the direction of a online player, it's some of the most talented live players, I think are putting in deliberate time for this method of study, even though they don't necessarily plan to play online for a living, even though they don't necessarily think they're going to make much money playing online. The kind of training ground mentality and understanding the value of building up data so that that data can be analyzed is really, really smart. So I use my database in a variety of ways. Probably the most important, though, is to analyze my own statistics and then to plan for future study by using those statistics. And of course, you can imagine that if these tools can be used to analyze where you're leaking, they can also be used to analyze where your opponents are leaking. So I'm going to cover both of those in a future video that's specifically about database review or database analysis. And this has been a really successful part of my private coaching. In general, it's very often the starting point for me to get to know a new student, and almost without fail, this method of coaching can reveal blind spots in your game. It can reveal areas of study that you didn't realize you needed. And it can also reveal what you're good at, which, as I've pointed out before, is really important, because so often we mindlessly study the same situations. You just develop this kind of routine. Oh, that's, I like studying that spot. I feel good about that spot. And we don't recognize, oh, I'm probably satisfactory in that area, and I probably don't need to continue to study that situation. And a little bit of database review, either with comparison to like solver statistics or with a coach or with a study partner, talking with your friends who also have their own statistics, comparing statistics with other players or with other regs in the game. These are all really good ways to leverage that data that you've collected and figure out how to interpret it in a way that is productive for planning your approach and also planning your future study. And that kind of gets into this last section here, which is community. I'll say a fundamental part of the planning for this course was about how to create the best learning environment possible. And a community is essential to that development process. It's essential to I don't want to say any learning environment, but it's really beneficial to working on a complex topic like poker, because everyone is starting from a different place and everyone has a different amount of information gathered from all these different sources. There's so much information to take in, and it's almost impossible for one person to have absorbed all of it in an efficient way. So to bring in a variety of people, whether that's you're using a forum, whether that's on a Discord server, whether that's through hired coaching, whatever way it is that you've networked through poker, everyone is going to bring a different perspective and a different amount of information. And almost certainly some of that is going to contribute in a way that you weren't able to recognize by yourself previously. So this is the main reason that this course includes a Discord community. I think that it's necessary and was one of the most valuable things for me when I was learning the game. Well, I didn't have Discord when I was learning the game, but using forums, communicating with other players, living with other players, back and forth is a huge accelerant in the learning process. So I think that knowing how to use this properly is sort of a secret strength for a lot of the best players, is that they have a good network behind them. They have a strong team, so to speak, behind them. So we're going to talk more about how to take advantage of not only the network that you have in general, but how to take advantage of one-on-one coaching, how to take advantage of groups like the one that we have for members of this course. And I think that you'll find that if you were working alone previously, there's a huge growth benefit to being part of a community where other people are working on the same thing, or they're pushing towards similar goals. So that's the overview of all the different methods that I'll be recommending or discussing in more detail throughout this course. Stay tuned for the specific breakdown of how to match up those different study methods with what you've identified in your evaluation previously.